I'd like to welcome her up here. I don't know what her talk is about today, but I sure am excited to have her here. Ann Klotz.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I think I'm vertically challenged here. So if Olivia is the future of Laurel, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the theme that I was told to talk about, by the way, which is preserve. He doesn't know what I'm talking about. So I named the talk about 7 times, but today's working draft is called Roots and Branches, Preserving Our Past to Inform the Future. And when Thomas was talking about the mission, I thought I should probably reveal to you that I'm actually a drama teacher turned head of school. That's a pretty unusual trajectory in most independent school leadership positions, but I felt like I should look and feel more artsy for this crowd, so I'm claiming my past, my own preservation. I'm still a drama teacher at Laurel School. And when I got here, he said, "Do you have any slides?" And I said, "No, this is totally a low-tech conversation about preservation." So here we go. I love this space, and I have loved it since I came here, because having a space dedicated to the preservation of Cleveland history feels like a great metaphor for my conversation with you. What is it that we preserve in schools, and how does preservation serve as a springboard for evolution and adaptation and innovation? And I was thinking as we came in this morning of the people who knew how important it was to hold on to the history of Cleveland and what that would mean for future generations. So some people might think about preservation as synonymous with lack of progress, but I challenge us to think about the notion of preservation as a necessary component of innovation. We must understand the past in order to shape the future. And I get to shape the future in a small way every day with a whole lot of fabulous humans who go to Laurel School. I am not even a Clevelander by birth, but I could get lost forever in the archives upstairs here in one of the mansions, which I once had the great fortune to be shown. I love history. I'm an English teacher, but I came pretty close to being a history major at one point. I love lots of chapters of our past, but I'm always conscious of how easy it is to romanticize the past and think about lacy white blouses and high button shoes, and to forget poverty and racism and elitism and the absence of indoor plumbing or antibiotics. And so I'm always kind of teetering on that fulcrum. Here at the Cleveland History Center, I'm trying to use the correct name because I had written down Western Reserve Historical Society, we preserve the history of this region to share with future generations. Children learn about the way things were. I escorted my own son when he was in 3rd grade to learn about the fact that Cleveland was a major stop on the Underground Railroad known as the City of Hope, and later a destination, of course, for the Great Migration. Learning from the past helps us make connections to our own experience, and perhaps more importantly, to consider how a deeper understanding of our past can help us strive towards a better future. As I often tell my girls, all 610 of them, we must hug the whole experience of being human. Joy and sorrow, pride and regret, what's positive and what's painful about the past, the present, and the future. In the spirit of full disclosure, I am a hoarder. Our storage unit in Solon, actually, if I'm really truthful, our 2 storage units in Solon, are stuffed with family ephemera that connects me and my husband to earlier generations. Letters my 4 uncles wrote home from the 4 different theaters of World War II where they served. Scrapbooks, hankies, photographs, journals. I, chief hoarder, hold these items as a way of holding on to our family stories. We pass the stories of our family down from one generation to the next, only occasionally editing for dramatic effect. I long to keep those cartons full of artifacts for my children's children. But will anyone really want those dusty documents that belong to ancestors they only know through stories or through the pitch we heard, your pitch on family photograph albums? I was so happy to hear that pitch. So the verb preserve is defined as maintaining something in its existing state. And my 9th grade English students, who have been steeped in broadening their vocabulary with me all year, would also add synonyms, because I asked them the other day, to keep safe from injury, harm, destruction, to conserve, protect, care for, look after, safeguard, keep. When I first contemplated the theme preserve, I thought of the shelves of canned goods displayed at the county fair near the little community where I spend time each summer. Rows of fruits and vegetables preserved for the winter, an old custom that continues in rural families: peaches, string beans, beets, tomatoes, jams and jellies, their jewel tones glowing in the late summer afternoon light. I have a clear memory from childhood of helping my own mom one August put up peaches. Canned peaches, she called them, which confused me because where were the cans? There were mason jars and metal lids and pressure cookers and pot holders and a lot of tension and steam and cautions about things being too hot. And at the end, we had a dozen jars full of white peaches. And when we ate them all winter, they tasted like August, sweet and fragrant, floating in a sticky syrup. Preserving fruits and vegetables have always had a practical purpose. It was a way to keep a variety of foods available before freezers were in vogue, and a way to feed our families. The art of preserving fruit is one that many of us are no longer familiar with, but YouTube, I discovered earlier this week, is full of helpful instructions, a modern strategy for reclaiming a traditional practice. Preserving fruit or ephemera or traditions keeps the present with us and carries it into the future. Sometimes we, schools and people, struggle with what to keep and what to jettison. Marie Kondoing our lives is not actually so easy, I think. I think about adult children confronted with the contents of an older parent's home. Who wants what? Can you let go of a piece of furniture that really is too big to fit into anyone's apartment? Will your children want their grandparents' wedding albums? Questions like these are freighted with emotion, bound up in love and obligation, and sometimes in a sense of feeling overwhelmed. This is a version of the same dilemma great schools face. Our tendency is to add new programming and never to subtract anything. We want to be distinct, but fear if we're missing an activity that a competitor school offers, we might lose out. The paradox is that keeping up with the Joneses can actually dilute every school's individuality. In education, tradition and preservation can be perceived as less alluring or dynamic than innovation. Out with the old and in with the new. But much of what endures in schools is old wine in new bottles, standard practices and concepts recycled and repackaged. Debates about homework, or how best to teach grammar, or which method of mathematics instruction we should use, are cyclical. The same conversations surface, get debated, resolved, acted upon, and then rise up a decade later. I've been at Laurel 15 years, so I'm midway through that cycle of things just coming back to us. What best serves our students? We ask that question perennially. We take pride in our history at Laurel, and we preserve it deliberately, keeping alive our past for our current girls. When Miss Jenny Prentice founded the Laurel Institute in 1896 in her home in Cleveland, handily pictured in one of the panels on the carousel, you can look for yourself this Sunday when you ride for free, schools for girls were innovative and subversive and even iconoclastic. I love that. Schools for girls have nothing to do with manners or etiquette. Schools for girls are about raising the revolution. So when, thanks to those Van Swearingen brothers, about whom I have very complicated feelings, the school was moved to Shaker Heights because Sarah Lyman sought more land to give girls more access to the outdoors, and we just celebrated our 90th birthday in the 44122. But when all that happened in 1928, girls' schools were still pretty new, as were colleges for women, and remember that votes for women were less than 10 years old. Now, Laurel is a long-established part of the landscape, the educational landscape of Cleveland. And we strive not to think of the past and the future as polarities, but to hold what works and to innovate through it, not in spite of it. In our swiftly moving world, I believe that it is good for girls to feel connected to something larger than themselves, to hear about the accomplishments of Laurel alumni, to know that there are legions of women interested in the girls, even though those alums may never know our students personally. We emphasize our school's past and the future that shimmers out in front of each one of them, explaining that someday too she might return to the school as a proud alum, as our own alumni will begin to do this morning while I am here with you. The girls see themselves placed along a beautiful continuum. Our mission at Laurel is to inspire each girl to fulfill her promise and to better the world. That back end has never felt more urgent to me. And our value statement goes like this: committed to building a just and inclusive world. Laurel girls are courageous, creative, ethical, and compassionate. And I thought that mapped rather well to the mission statement that you had on that pretty slide at the beginning. Known well by all of our girls, these two touchstones guide everything that we do. They remind the girls of our lofty expectations. We intend to continue to graduate generations of girls who will change this world for better. In the first dark days of the Depression, Headmistress Sarah Lyman wrote the checks to pay her faculty from her own checking account. A little more than a decade later, Edna Lake, Lyman's successor, took in English children escaping the London Blitz and waived tuition for some families when their financial circumstances were too dire. And later that decade, she routinely closed the school to take all the girls to opening day for the Indians. Generosity, selflessness, fun, those are good messages to share with girls about learning. In my earliest years as headmistress, my infant son was often with me at school. I wanted to model for the girls that the woman leading their school could be both a mom and have a career about which she feels passionate. Stories told and retold show all the aspects of being human. In the same way that I started by explaining my own family's obsession with our history, so schools are shaped by the narratives we tell and retell. Teachers know that it is stories that promote recall. So now a little story about American education. By the early years of the 20th century, Laurel was up and running, but education grew divorced from the need for students to acquire skills associated with any craft. Students didn't go to school to learn how to be a blacksmith or a carpenter or a weaver. They'd actually never gone to school to do those things. They'd learn by doing. Apprentices working their way up until they acquired mastery. Mastery, an old term made new again right now in Cleveland. While many in America agreed that school was important for every child, schoolwork itself felt abstract and without purpose. Enter John Dewey, 20th century philosopher and educational reformer, who recommended that teachers make learning experiential. He's considered the father of progressive education, in which students learn by doing, and concepts are carefully entwined or braided together. To understand the economics of making cloth, for example, students might shear a sheep, or perhaps watch a sheep get sheared, work with raw wool, prepare it to make yarn, compare that wool with raw cotton, feel and discuss the differences, then build a loom and learn to weave. By weaving and starting from scratch, students choose materials and understand the labor involved in making a piece of cloth or a beautiful garment. Those experiences are memorable, and they offer learning that lasts well beyond the conclusion of a unit. I still remember with great satisfaction the triumph I felt when, as a member of my second grade class, we built a freestanding igloo in conjunction with our study of the Arctic. That would have been about 1968 or 9. So progressive education suggests moving forward, but it's because we've taken care to preserve our history at Laurel as a progressive school that we can reach back into that history to reanimate progressive tenets that have existed in our school since its founding. Jenny Prentice was influenced by the writings of John Dewey. Central to progressive education is the concept of educating students to be contributing, engaged members of society. Dewey knew, far ahead of the rest of us, that habits of mind and learning how to learn would eventually become more important than content. For centuries, as you know, content mattered hugely because its access was so limited. But as technological advances put books in the hands of many and now computers in the hands of most, Dewey seemed prescient in his understanding that our real job as educators was teaching children to question, to problem solve, to discern, to think both critically and creatively, to wonder about how ideas relate, to make meaning by doing, and to develop the habits of mind that will allow them to be curious throughout their lives. That industrial model with which we associate traditional schooling eclipsed the child-centered, more progressive ideals of Dewey and Francis Parker because the industrial model was more efficient. Schools asked children to sit in rows, fill out worksheets with bells ringing to punctuate set times for English or math or science. We adopted a calendar that still acknowledged the need for students to help families bring in crops over a long summer break, but we didn't adjust the calendar when farm life gave way to city and suburban life. And when the space race began, sort of commensurate with the start of my childhood, we as a nation fell in love with technology and the advances it brought. In my own life as a school teacher that stretches back 37 years, I know that the more technologically advanced we become, the less our students understand about how things are actually made, even how a computer is put together, though they're extremely adept at and quick to adopt a new technology. I'm not sure they even wonder enough about how it's made. So you need not hear my long digression about the advantages and disadvantages of technology. I'll save that for another talk, but I'll hum a few bars about unintended consequences. First, as I said, so much content is now available with the swipe of a screen. So our job is to help students discern what's credible, to help them think about what they read. There's no doubt in my mind that technology allows me to produce material faster, and when the batteries are charged and the computer behaves, after I've restarted 3 times, I do write more swiftly and with less frustration than I once did by hand or with the whiteout cartridge that I thought was so fancy that I popped in and out of my Selectrix typewriter. But the pace of our technology-rich lives can be hard to sustain. There's so much that comes at us, a relentless tsunami of information. And I'll digress for a moment to suggest that tied perhaps to that onslaught of constant information is a skill that does feel hard to preserve, and that is civil discourse. More and more, it seems to me, that teaching students how to really listen to different points of view and how to take in information before formulating a rebuttal or demonizing the person with whom you disagree is essential. How do we help students break free of the self-confirming echo chamber that social media provides? How do we help them adopt a real willingness to listen, to learn, to risk changing their minds? Civil discourse, to me, it feels is well worth preserving, very hard to do, though we are hard at work on it at Laurel School. So back to preserve. Deep-rooted practice is the opposite of flash-in-the-pan ideas that pass swiftly. Feedback and revision have always improved all kinds of writing. Practice helps both musicians and athletes. Speaking a target language exclusively when studying French or Chinese or Spanish increases fluency. All of these ideas are as old as learning itself and as valuable. Therefore, we preserve them as useful practices. Our school's job today, and maybe forever, is to prepare students for a future we cannot anticipate. We know our students today are apt to have many careers or many different chapters in their lives. We need to help them be ready to grow their expertise as they meet a particular challenge or new topic. Not every fact needs to be recalled. There is, after all, that iPhone in their pockets. But they must know how to go about refreshing their knowledge or acquiring new skills when necessary. Whereas several generations ago, young people learned what they needed to know by watching their parents or apprenticing with a master craftsman, now it feels like there is so much to know that it can be overwhelming to consider how to convey what's essential. We no longer ask girls to memorize a lot by rote or to do piles and piles of worksheets, because there's no evidence that those practices contribute to deep learning. But we do ask children to read every night, a practice that builds comprehension and vocabulary and an understanding of the world. Standards-based grading, which we've used at Laurel for several years in a number of subjects, requires students to retain and demonstrate mastery of concepts and a certain amount of content over the course of an entire year. This is real learning, the opposite of studying material to succeed on a test on Tuesday and then forget all that material by Friday. Inspired by our own legacy as a progressive school, we know that spending time in the natural world is essential for children of all ages. At our Butler campus, 150 acres in Russell and Chester townships, we have wild spaces in which to learn and play. Unsupervised hours of outdoor play, enjoyed by those my age and older, are no longer so common. Tightly scheduled children rarely play without an agenda. But play is the real work of childhood. So we build in time for children to play as they learn, work things out when inevitable conflicts arise. Grown-ups are near, but not monitoring every breath. Butler has inspired us to design interdisciplinary immersion experiences that encourage our girls to make sense of the world by experiencing the natural world. Our students discover the progression of seasons, and they link concepts from science and art and literature and social studies. In our outdoor pre-primary, modeled after the forest kindergarten, children explore those 150 acres in every weather while learning how to be resilient and how to problem solve. And during their study of the Shakers every fall, our third graders make biscuits and applesauce and cure pickles. Little known skill. Each girl works many hours with a hand drill to make a pegboard out of oak. And in fourth grade, they build an actual weight-bearing bridge, drawing on all sorts of information from their classwork. We don't expect our girls to grow up to be woodworkers or literal bridge builders, but we know that these skills increase a girl's willingness to solve problems, to embrace risks, and to work as a member of the team, and to understand the value of perseverance and hard work. And we do expect that they're going to grow up to be figurative bridge builders, solving problems and finding solutions in their communities, not only making John Dewey, but all the rest of us proud. There's an obvious link between preservation and conservation, a metaphorical relationship that makes sense for children. Resources, both human and natural, are finite, and we've thought carefully at Butler about what we preserve and what we develop. Another example of a traditional practice adapted for today is Laurel's commitment to design thinking. Recently popularized by Stanford University and IDEO, design thinking uses the same process any creative group utilizes when trying to prototype solutions or meet a need or solve a problem. It's a process that encourages empathy and mistakes and missteps, and it celebrates iteration and eschews perfection, which is hugely important for the driven and ambitious girls who go to Laurel. In addition to asking girls to rise to academic challenge, we want girls to embrace physical challenge. We have an incredible priority. Sarah Lyman made that a priority when she moved our school out to Shaker. Our low-tech experiences in adventure, canoeing, hiking, rock climbing, give girls the opportunity to develop a sense of competence. And competence, of course, builds confidence. We also know girls must be able to use their voices to become change agents. In the late 1980s, Then Harvard professor Carol Gilligan conducted research at Laurel to discover how adolescent girls made decisions. She found, this will surprise none of you, that when girls lose their voices, typically in middle school, they stop speaking up, take themselves out of difficult conversations. But speaking one's truth and having to support that truth with reasoned arguments is an important developmental milestone. So we work hard not to let our girls fall silent. We incorporate many opportunities for girls to use their voices: speech and debate, Model UN, plays, opportunities to connect with social justice initiatives through our collaborations with Facing History and Ourselves, clubs, affinity groups, and of course publications, because not every voice needs to be a spoken voice. At Laurel, we preserve the principles of a classical liberal arts education in which thinking critically is a skill that never goes out of style. And because we know that through giving of ourselves, we cultivate altruism and empathy, we've embedded service learning in our program. We seek experiences for our girls that encourage them to grapple with nuanced issues requiring complex solutions, engaging with and learning from any group they serve. In some girls, that sense of service helps them understand with great relief that the world actually doesn't revolve around them, and they can cultivate a passion for doing something meaningful in the world. Much of what I've described to you today, the growth mindset of adventure, the iterative value of design thinking, a sense of purpose through service, and the classical elements of a liberal arts education, is programming backed with substantive research that we've drawn on thanks to Laurel's Center for Research on Girls, which we founded in 2008 to put the world's best research to work for girls. And it's a revival of our commitment to research that dates from Jenny Prentice's days and her interest in Dewey. In private schools, we laugh that if you do something more than once, it becomes a tradition. So I wanted to speak a little bit about tradition. Great traditions cannot be preserved like flies in amber. They have to morph over time. Traditions and rituals help establish a culture. They feel a little tribal. This is how we do things. And a school as old as Laurel is anchored by many much-loved traditions that punctuate the school year. But there were traditions that worried me when I arrived at Laurel. Maybe they were founded with good-hearted fun in mind, but they, with a contemporary lens, are no longer serving us. So, for example, there was a scavenger hunt that a lot of the private school students participated in that was actually both embarrassing and humiliating and downright dangerous. So I squashed it. An emphasis on Christian hymns at Laurel excluded our Jewish and Muslim and atheist girls. In our zeal to preserve, we have to always challenge ourselves to look closely at the meta messages, because it's easy for traditions to become passé or not to be inclusive. Being stuck is a death knell for education. A wise educator with whom I worked years ago once met my enthusiastic proposal about what I thought was a brilliant suggestion with these kind words: "Well, we tried that 10 years ago. Maybe it's time to try it again." And her willingness to allow me the freedom to pilot something and recycle an old idea has shaped what I believe about school. We must keep trying new ideas, reclaiming and revisiting and adapting them. And I self-identify as a progressive educator who values preservation. At Laurel, we work hard not to deify the past, but to learn from it and appreciate it and look at it critically. In the play that I wrote recently with our primary girls, we learned about the history of suffrage here in Cleveland and the passage of the 19th Amendment. Looking at our own past was a remarkable way to help our little girls feel empowered, to feel part of something big and part of history. And I'll close with this quotation from a 1972 book on preservation philosophy in the Tucson barrio. Quote, "Americans seem to be eager to destroy their tangible cultural heritage by continually permitting that heritage to fall prey to the bulldozer. As a result, all that remains from certain historical periods today are written accounts and statements by historians. Although our cultural heritage dates back only 400 years, less is known about certain phases of our historical development than is known about civilization dating back much farther." End quote. I don't want to bulldoze Laurel's heritage, or Cleveland's heritage or my family's heritage. I want it to travel with us. Thank you so much for listening.